Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Lessons of Vietnam show. Glad to have you here today. We're going to continue somewhat of a series we had started, Who Do We Fight? But before we get started on that, let's talk about who we are and what we're doing. The Vietnam War was the first televised war of short video clips with no story behind what they were showing. As a result, the Vietnam War was misunderstood, full of myths and half-truths and lies. Our mission from day one has been to tell the real story of the Vietnam War and the people involved. To make a comment during the show, by the way, if you got something to say, dial 919-434-7345, and that is not the right number. I did not change that. I forgot about that. That's my number. But don't call that during the show because it won't work.
Yeah, call 919-518-9773.
There you go. So that's why I have Amnon to look after me here. I did not remember that until I just saw that. Or even better, just go to Computers 2K Voice. And that way you can make a comment and ask questions or whatever it is that you'd like to do. If you have something to tell me after the show, it's DixonBill80@yahoo.com. The show is brought to you from the studios of Nissan Communications. And I am your host, producer, editor, researcher, trash can emptier, Bill Dixon, Vietnam 67 to 68. Okay. Now, if you are a veteran out there and you're in a crisis mode, please understand that there's somebody out there waiting to help you. It's easy to feel sometimes by yourself. It's like recently, what I tell people if they want to stop a veteran suicide is have a better reaction from the VA. A couple of weeks ago, a gentleman went to the VA hospital in Florida. He could not prove he was a veteran. He was in bad shape, and any hospital is supposed to take you in and take care of you when you're in an emergency situation. He was in an emergency situation, but they said he couldn't prove he was a vet, so they sent him on his way. He died before he got to the other hospital. But in this case, is somebody there. Just call them, press 1, and talk to them. If you are a family member of a veteran who's in crisis, please call the line and get some help. Thank you. Okay. We got the commercials and all the important stuff taken care of. Now let's get right on into the show. I did a lot of speaking in high school. I had a young man say, well, all y'all thought was farmers. How come you didn't do better? And at the time, I was just kind of shocked with that comment. But I've been thinking about it, and this show is going to answer a lot of those questions. Who did the American military fight during the American Vietnamese War? Okay. Now, the reason we're going to go into who, and it actually should be who and what, but I'm going to give you a list of the people or the things we fought against. We fought against the Vietcong, which we've been talking about in another series. We'll talk about a little bit here. We're talking about the problems we fought against was the North Vietnamese military or the PAVA, the People's Army of Vietnam. Russia, who supplied supplies. China, who supplied supplies. The rules of engagement was another thing we fought against. At times, we fought against the United States government. Sometimes we were fighting against the corruption of American and Vietnamese governments, especially the Vietnamese governments. South Vietnamese government, definitely. The American press, the lies and misinformation of the protesters, the communist propaganda, the war of attrition, the environment, and the chemical war. These are all the things that the soldiers in Vietnam fought against. And some of them are going to probably surprise you there, but I'm going to try to go into some detail and tell you why we come up with this. And we're talking about the Vietcong. That was kind of the rear ones. That was the guy talking about farmers. The Vietcong was the military arm of the National Liberation Front, NFL, an underground communist insurgency formed in December 1960 and active in South Vietnam. The seeds of the NFL were several thousand communists who defied the terms of the Geneva Accord of 1954 and remained underground in South Vietnam. When it was divided up and it was given, everybody who wanted to go non-communist was supposed to go south, and everybody that was communist was supposed to go north, they stayed south. As supporters for the NFL grew, it adopted organizations and command structures similar to those of the Lao Dong, as well as its own military arm, the Vietcong. The NFL and Vietcong were shadow organizations that blended into rural life, but remained politically and military active, recruiting and disseminating propaganda. Vietcong bombings and operations increased from late 1961 using guerrilla methods. They targeted foreign and government personnel, buildings, and facilities. I'll give you an idea who the Viet Cong were, and it was broken up in different structures, which we've talked about on another show. Although the North Vietnamese Regular Army, NVA, was generally a uniform force that was well equipped and trained, the effectiveness of the VC was heightened despite their comparative lack of training and equipment, simply because it was seldom easy to identify who they were when patrolling through the villages. When you went through a village, how could you tell the good guys and the bad guys? Well, the bad guys would shoot at you. Other than that, you couldn't tell the difference. Okay? By the spring of 1967, a river of aid was flowing from Russia into North Vietnam. By the late 1960s, more than 3/4 of the military and technical equipment received by North Vietnam was coming from Moscow. Moscow contributed weapons essential to North Vietnamese defense capabilities against the Americans' air war, including radar systems, anti-aircraft artillery, and surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs. And that's a SAM, surface-to-air missile. China also played an important role in the Vietnam War during 1950 to 1975. China helped Vietnam against French forces during their first Indochina War, and later that was when they fought the French at Dien Bien Phu, and later helped North Vietnam unite the nation by fighting South Vietnam and the United States in the Vietnam War. However, with the failure of the North Vietnamese and Chinese negotiation in 1968, the People's Republic of China began to withdraw support for the sake of preparing for a clash with the Soviets. Chinese influence over North Vietnam diminished from that point. I'll go into that a little bit later. Throughout the 1950s and most of 1960, Mao, which the head of China, Mao Zedong, considered the United States the primary threat to China's security and revolution. Thus, Mao's support for Ho Chi Minh started with the security concern. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, with the deterioration relations between China and the Soviet Union, especially after the Sino-Soviet border conflict in March 1969, Mao further clarified that the Soviet Union was the primary threat to China's national security. Now, shortly after the war, China and Vietnam had a clash. Right now, the biggest thing Vietnam is worried about is the Chinese coming in. Now, the next thing, the most powerful military on earth, with a defense budget bigger than gross product of some small countries, was unable to defeat the guerrilla forces of North Vietnam. However, in many ways, the U.S. fought the Vietnam War with arm tied behind its back and had to contend with a vast and wide-ranging list of rules before a shot could even be fired. These rules were known as the Rules of Engagement, ROE, and became a serious point of frustration for U.S. troops and commanders during the war. The rules had good intentions, but over time became so convoluted and confusing that many U.S. lives were lost in the process of abiding by them. I want to read that part again. The rules had good intentions, but over time became so convoluted and confusing that many U.S. lives were lost in the process of abiding by them. In the simplest form, the rules of engagement dictated when you could fight the enemy and where. Because of the different nations, branches, locations, and weapon systems that were involved in the war, different rules apply to different people, which could change, and again, depending on your location, and change once more a few days later. They often contradicted the conventional procedures taught during training and gave the enemy extra opportunity to strike or hide. One of the biggest gripes troops had with the rules of engagement was that in many cases they could only attack after they had been attacked first, even if an imminent assault was likely. This cost many American lives and gave the enemy plenty of time to establish positions of operate in relative safety as long as they weren't attacked or clearly about to. Airmen in general had a tough time with rules of engagement. With aircraft from the United States Air Force, United States Army, United States Marine Corps, U.S. Navy, all been subjected to different rules. On one occasion, U.S. planes based in South Vietnam were allowed to conduct a strike, but aircraft based in Thailand were not cleared to join them. Crews flying over Vietnam had to deal with different rules depending on what airspace they were currently in, what their mission was, where they came from, and the type of aircraft they were in. These rules could then vary depending on what the potential hostile aircraft was doing, who it was operated by, what airspace it occupied, and what type of plane it was. Now, you're flying along, you see an enemy guy, you got to go through all this thinking about where they are, who they are, why they're there, and what kind of airplane. One of the more curious locations thought over during Vietnam was Michelin's rubber tree plantation. Yes, Michelin, the tire company. This plantation was a major headache for U.S. troops that they were forbidden from calling in artillery or enemies inside of it. And Michelin was all over Vietnam. Had some right up from where I was at Long Binh. Michelin continued to use the plantations throughout the war, and it made large amounts of money. The trees were not to be damaged by the fighting, and any damage to the plantation had to be repaid to Michelin by the United States. Naturally, artillery was not an option in the forest, and the North Vietnamese quickly realized this. They started setting up positions in the plantation that were safe from artillery. You came under attack from the Mission River plantation, you'd have to call and ask for permission. And you may get permission within 4 or 5 hours or 4 or 5 days. As Secretary of Defense for the John F. Kennedy administration in 1961, 1963, Robert McNamara had important influence on the early escalation in Vietnam. McNamara was a former president of Ford Motor Company and was lauded by Kennedy as a technocrat, an efficient administrator. As communist insurgents from North Vietnam called the Vietcong began to infiltrate South Vietnam, McNamara urged Kennedy to lend financial and military support to Diem, the leader of South Vietnam. Diem, however, proved to be a poor leader and had a heavy-handed, violent ruler. In 1963, McNamara's indecision regarding what to do about Diem gave the American ambassador to South Vietnam considerable leeway to push his own plan. This plan got out of McNamara's control and ultimately resulted in Diem's assassination and replacement. We knew that they knew they was going to do it, and we stood by and let it be because Diem was not doing what the United States government was doing. His brother was very outspoken. His sister-in-law, Madame New, when the Buddhist monk set fire to himself, she made a comment about the barbecue there in Saigon. As the Kong continued to attack South Vietnam from the north, McNamara shaped President Johnson's policy. He argued that the U.S. was vastly superior to the Vietnamese communists in terms of technology and military might, and strongly urged the president to take a hard line. Johnson did just that in 1965. At McNamara's urging, he ordered the first U.S. combat troops to protect South Vietnam from communist incursions. McNamara also played a significant role in forming and escalating Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained massive U.S. aerial bombing of targets in North Vietnam. The president trusted McNamara's assessments and regularly met him over Tuesday lunches to select bombing sites. Now, that's an important part right there. I'll take a second to explain what I'm talking about here. McNamara did everything by computers. In the United States, in Washington, they would decide what was a friendly village, what was a bad village. And that's the way they would pinpoint it. And you go by the friendly village, and every time you go by that friendly village, one of you guys got hurt, shot, stepped on a landmine, or whatever. But that was the one that McNamara's side was a friendly village, and he hadn't been there. And then another village you go to, and that's a bad village. That's kept by BC, and a lot of BC in there. But every time you go by, the kids come out and sell you pineapple and Cokes and so forth. So it's kind of hard to understand why it's called a bad village and the other one's called a good village. But he made this, Johnson bragged that the American military could not bomb an outhouse without his approval. So who was going to be bombed, when they were going to be bombed, and if they were going to be bombed was all decided in Washington by McNamara's computer, more so than Westmoreland or the leaders on the ground in Vietnam. Black market drugs, prostitution, corruption, run by senior NCOs. Vietnam was our most corrupt war in history, with the mafia within our military stealing not millions but billions in food, weapons, uniform, supplies of every kind, often leaving troops in the field without food, weapons, medicine, and supplies. Ships were unloaded in one port, and things would be either sold on the black market in Vietnam or shipped back out for places unknown. The scale was massive. The network that allowed it blackmailed officers through widespread prostitution, payoffs, and physical threats. The biggest source of money was drugs. Not a few ounces sewn into corpses like the internet rumors tell of this, but containers of heroin and bundles of cash big enough to fill the trunk of a car. The corporate senior non-commissioned officers in the Army and Marines, some arrested, but most promoted and retired honorably, some as multi-millionaires. Sometimes in order to get stuff that you needed, it was easy to go to town and get it off and buy it off black market rather than go through supply, because quite often supply didn't have it, but you go down to the black market and get anything you wanted. When there was no turkey dinner on Christmas or Thanksgiving, it had been sold. When boots rotted off the feet of troops in the field, there were no replacements. They had to be sold. They had been sold. When malaria pills were unavailable and thousands got sick, they had been sold. Tens of billions in food, equipment, every kind of consumer goods in the world were shipped to Vietnam by a grateful nation for its men in the field. Almost none of it ever reached those it was intended for. Troops ate aging sea rations designated for disposal as having gone bad, used weapons slated for destruction, and wore uniforms taken off the wounded and the dead. The guys in the field would have a pile, and they go pick out something out of the pile, often that they could wear. While a few thousand fought in Vietnam, thousands more lived like kings, exotic food, luxurious living, boy and girl prostitutes daily, maid service, waxed and polished helicopters and jeeps, and a life of total leisure. The Army Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, was in many ways ill-adapted to meet the insurgency of the Vietcong. High-ranking officers appointed on the basis of their family connections and political reliability were often apathetic, incompetent, or corrupt, and sometimes all three. The higher ranks of the Army were also thoroughly penetrated by Vietcong agents who held positions varying from drivers, clerks, and radio operators to senior headquarters officers. In other words, if you wanted to be a colonel in the Vietnamese Army, all you had to do was have family who kind of slipped money to the right people, and you became a colonel. The only problem was you had no experience in leading men. And without leadership, it definitely shows up, especially when you come under fire. In July 1955, the South Vietnam's Prime Minister Diem announced in a broadcast that South Vietnam would not participate in the elections specified in the Geneva Accords. As Saigon's delegation did not sign the Geneva Accords, it was not bound by it. Now, a lot of people say that they didn't want to have the election because they were scared that Ho Chi Minh would get elected in, because everybody liked Ho Chi Minh. That's kind of proven to be not true. But South Vietnam had nothing to do with the Geneva Accords. So by not signing the accords, they were not bound by the election. Diem asked voters to approve a republic, thus removing King Bao Dao as head of state. When it was divided up, it was former King Bao Dao was named prime minister. And now with the voters, they're going to get rid of him and have a more of a democratic form of society. Okay. The election was supervised by his younger brother, Nu. Diem was credited with 98% of the votes. In many districts, there were more votes removed Bao Dao than there were registered voters. That sounds interesting. In Saigon, 133% of the registered population reportedly voted to remove Bao Dao. 133% of the registered population. Let's see, I think that means that 33% of the votes were people who were not even there. I guess a lot of dead people voted there. Sounding more and more familiar. Let's see. Diem's American advisors had recommended a more modest winning margin of 60 to 7%. Diem, however, viewed the election as a test of authority. On the 26th of October 1955, Diem declared himself the president of the newly proclaimed Republic of Vietnam. The Diem government lost support among the populace and from the Kennedy administration due to its repression of Buddhist and military defeats by the Vietcong. If you send troops out without training and you've got a colonel who bought a position and you go in and fight and somebody knows what they're doing, that would be a good reason why that you lost the battle. The situation came to a head when special forces went to raid Buddhist temples across the country, leaving a death toll estimated to be in the hundreds. Diem was overthrown in a coup on 1 November 1963 with the knowledge and approval of the United States. Diem's removal and assassination set off a period of political instability and declining legitimacy of the Saigon government. Just what you need when you're fighting the war. General Long Van Minh became president, but he was ousted in January 1964. General Nguyen Han Van Quoc Suor, okay, I'm not even going to try that one, was named head of state, but power remained with a junta of generals led by Khan, which soon fell to infighting. Meanwhile, the Gulf of Tonkin incident of 2nd of August 1964 led to the dramatic increase in direct American participation in the war, with nearly 200,000 troops deployed by the end of the year. Khan sought to capitalize on the crisis with the Vung Tau Charter, a new constitution that would have curtailed civil liberties and concentrated his power, but was forced to back down in the face of widespread protests and strikes. Coup attempts followed in September and February 1965. The later resulted in the Air Marshals Nguyen Cao Ky becoming Prime Minister and General Hu becoming nominal head of state. In other words, they were more busy fighting who was going to be the head of the government than they were fighting the war. Kien Thu functioned in those roles until 1967, bringing much desired stability to the government. They imposed censorship and suspended civil liberties and intensified anti-communist efforts. Under pressure from the United States, they held elections for president and the legislature in 1967. The Senate election took place on 2nd December 1967. The presidential election took place on the Senate, September 2nd. The presidential election took place on 3 September 1967. Who was elected president with a 34% of the vote in widely criticized poll. Who was reelected unopposed in the presidential election 2nd of October 1971. You can see Thu there, and you can see Nguyen Cao Ky, who was a fighter pilot. He was quite a dashing man, walking around with his riding crop and his tight, personally manicured uniforms. The role of the media. Before I started the role of media, I want to go back and talk a little bit. We were talking about the government. It got so bad, and all the presidents that were there got so bad, they brought their best units and kept them around Saigon to protect them from a coup rather than send them out to fight the Vietcong. So the best soldiers were kept there in the Saigon region, while the lesser soldiers were sent out to actually fight the war. Now, the role of media in the Vietnam War is a subject of continuing controversy. Amen. The Vietnam conflict is often referred to as the first television war. Film from Vietnam was flown to Tokyo for quick development and editing, and then flown on to the United States. Television brought battles directly to the American living rooms. But in fact, most television stories were filmed soon after a battle rather than in the midst of one, and many were simply conventional news stories. The people had never seen dead people and things burning. They didn't understand what a war was all about, and it was shocking. And they were there every night, almost like they were addicted. Indeed, most stories about the war on nightly TV news shows were not film records fresh from Vietnam, but rather brief reports based on wire service dispatches and read by an anchorman or woman. The Tet Offensive was a turning point for public opinion. On January 30th, 1968, the Vietcong attacked 120 American and South Vietnamese locations. The U.S. regained all its lost ground, but the Tet Offensive was politically defeated for the United States, partly due to media coverage. Now, not only we regained all this lost ground, but we basically decimated the Vietcong as a fighting unit. It was a pretty good win for the American military. However, Americans were shocked to see Marines battling Vietcong commandos for the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The center of the American presence in Vietnam, and the symbol that everybody looked at, it was reported that the communists had taken over the American embassy, even though they never got any further than the courtyard. They blew a hole in the fence and got into the courtyard, and that's where they were fought by the MPs. A now famous photo of a South Vietnamese general executing a Vietcong prisoner forced America to question their allies. There was a good story, and we've talked about the story of why that guy was shot. I think anybody else would have shot him. He was not in uniform, which made him a spy. CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, as I used to call him, Walter Concrete, reported that the U.S. was mired in a stalemate. This may not seem devastating today, but there is simply no one Americans trust today like they trusted Walter Cronkite in 1968, which is why Johnson made the statement, if he'd lost Concrete, he'd lost American people. Worst of all, the scale and scope of the offensive had led many Americans to believe that the leaders were lying to them about American progress in Vietnam, which they were. As a result, the polls shifted. Those who viewed Vietnam as not a mistake would never again be in the majority. A September 1969 poll, a 7-point uptick in opposition to the war from January. Now, a June Life magazine published the names and photographs of 242 Americans killed over a week period in Vietnam. But in reality, any death is bad, but during that same period in America, there were more killed in drunk driving accidents than were killed that week in Vietnam. Yes, they were dead, but you also have to keep in perspective that here and where we're not having a war, we lost more people in that same period of time. So why did they pick that to do that instead of the drunk drivers? The 77-day siege of Khe Sanh by the communists always showed the Marines hunkered down in holes like rats. But in reality, they returned more fire than they received. Given the 9 months between the polls, however, that increase in dissent could also be explained by continuing casualties. History of anti-war protests. The United States is as old as the country itself. Every war in American history, even the ones that spawned in the country, generated internal dissent from pacifists who rejected all wars and from citizens who rejected specific military conflicts on moral, religious, political, and economic grounds. The first war to be declared by the United States sparked one of the strongest anti-war movements in American history, the Federalist Party. stronghold of New England in particular opposed war with Great Britain on political and economic grounds. New York City. The New York City stood deeply divided at the start of the Civil War in April 1861. Its merchants and financial institutions were loath to lose their southern business, and the city's then mayor, Fernando Wood, had called for the city to secede from the Union. New York's poorer citizens, meanwhile, increasingly came to see the war as benefiting only the rich, filling the coffers of the city's elites with the financial spoils of battle. The conflict became known as the rich man's war, poor man's battle. The passage of the nation's first military draft act in March of 1863 only worsened the situation. Shortly after the Union put in the draft, the South also put in the draft. But not only did it allow men, presumably only the wealthy, to buy their way out of military service by paying commutation fee of $300, more than $5,500 in today's money, but also exempted African Americans from the draft as they weren't yet considered American citizens. So if you were a rich man and you got drafted, all you had to do was go find a poor man and pay him to take your place. Okay, opposition to the draft was widespread across the North, and in New York, some of the bill's loudest critics could be found in city government. As politicians, primarily Democrats, railed against the bill's legality and its impact on the city's working class poor. In the years following Kennedy's assassination, American involvement in Vietnam deepened. The administration of Lyndon B. Johnson sent the first American combat troops to Vietnam. That's a little, I guess, what you call combat troops and advisors. Gets kind of thin line there. A contingent of Marines who arrived on March 8, 1965, they landed at Red Beach, right outside of Da Nang. That spring, a small protest movement developed mainly among college students. Using lessons from the civil rights movement, a group of students began to hold teach-ins on college campuses to educate their colleagues about the war. The efforts to raise awareness and rally protests against the war picked up momentum. A leftist student organization, Students for a Democratic Society, commonly known as SDS, called for protests in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, April 17, 1965. Feelings about the war continued to intensify. On April 15, 1967, more than 100,000 people demonstrated against the war with a march through New York City. And New York City in their protest, and a rally held at the United Nations. On October 21st, 1967, a crowd of estimating 50,000 protesters marched from Washington, D.C. to the parking lots of the Pentagon. Armed troops had been called in to protect the building. And you wonder how many of these people were against the war, or, hey, I don't care about the war, just don't draft me. The Vietnam War protests inspired many popular songs that became anthem for their generation. Phil Oakes wrote, "What are you fighting for?" in 1963, and "I Ain't Marching Anymore" in 1965. Other songs whose very titles were a protest unto themselves, including Pete Seeger's "Bring 'Em Home," Joan Baez, "The Saigon Bride." They had a special bunker for her in Hanoi when it was being bombed. Nina Simone's Backlash Blues, 1967, took a civil rights poem by Langston Hughes and adapted it into a protest of Vietnam. "Raise my taxes, freeze my wages, send my son to Vietnam." Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" from 1971 went on to become the most popular song of all times. There were some of the best music, the word of protest music. Still listen to and enjoy them today. Boxer Muhammad Ali was a prominent American who resisted being drafted into service during the Vietnam War. Became a Muslim and said they were against war. And Ali, then heavyweight champion of the world, declared himself a conscientious objector, earning a prison sentence later overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court and a 3-year ban from boxing. Now, you take a man out of boxing and his physical status for 3 years, you've taken a lot of money out of his pocket. In 1969, the government instituted the first U.S. draft lottery. Now, up until that time, you were basically drafted by your local draft board. When you turned 18, you signed up in whatever city you lived in, the draft board there would be the ones who would decide who went and who did not go. And if your parents had money, you could very well get out of the draft. But then it went to the lottery. Everybody's birthday was put in on a ping pong ball and put in a thing, and it was drawn out like you were playing bingo. And whatever number was the number of your birth date. So the draft lottery that was the first one since World War II. Incited a vast amount of controversy and caused many young men to flee to Canada to avoid conscription. In other words, if you came out with a low number, you knew you need to pack. Now, whether you went to pack to go to Canada or you packed to go to the military was a decision you had to make. Tensions ran higher than ever, spurred by mass demonstrations and incidents of official violence such as those at Kent State in May of 1970, when National Guard troops shot into a group of protesters demonstrating, I'm going to add that, protesting students demonstrating against the U.S. invasion of Cambodia, killing 4 students. John Kerry, Vietnam veteran, came home because he had been wounded 3 times. That's another story into itself. John Kerry and some additional Vietnam veterans founded a group known as Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They testified before Congress of babies being killed and other supposed war atrocities. But some of those testifying had never been to Vietnam. And the group Vietnam Veterans Against the War knew some of those people had never been to Vietnam, could not have killed babies and so forth, but they allowed them to go up there and say this stuff. Yes, babies were killed. It's a war. Unfortunately, you can't take the civilians out because they're being used by the communists. Don't know of anybody that went in there on purpose, as happening today. And of course, Jane Fonda, actress and workout guru, traveled to North Vietnam, made speeches supporting the communists, and after visiting tortured American POWs, came back to the United States stating they were well cared for and were not being tortured. Now, in a famous interview with Jeremiah Denton, he was talking when they were interviewing him, but he was blinking in voice code torture, saying that they were being tortured and they were being treated really bad. She had her picture taken in Hanoi sitting in an anti-aircraft gun waiting to shoot down the Americans. As you can see that right there, Ho Chi Jane. I'm simply door living in a communist society, but I'm doing so well as a capitalist. She said one time, if you understood communism like she did, that you would be becoming communist. Jane and actor Donald Sutherland started an anti-USO troop to counter Bob Hope's famous shows for the troops. They called it FTA, which they said stood for Free the Army. But it also was a not so subtle nod to the expression of F the Army, which they used during their shows. By July 1972, when Fonda accepted an invitation to North Vietnam, America had been at war overseas with itself for years. During her 2-week stay, Fonda concluded that Americans were unjustly bombing farmland and areas far flung from the military targets. North Vietnamese press reported, and Fonda later confirmed, that she made several radio announcements over the Voice of Vietnam radio to implore U.S. pilots to stop the bombings. After Fonda returned from her trip to the State Department, spoke out against her. It's always distressing to find American citizens who benefit from the protection and assistance of this government lending their voice to any way to governments such as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Distressing indeed, says State Department spokesman Charles W. Bray, according to the July 1972 Reuters story. And we have the same situation right now in Russia and a basketball player. Some lawmakers called her action treason. Congress held hearings. The VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, passed a resolution calling for her to be prosecuted as a traitor. But most dramatically, in March 1973, the Maryland state legislature held a hearing to have Fonda and her films barred from the state. Dale Williams Burkhead, a Democrat from Anne Arundel, said, I want to kill her. I wouldn't want to kill her, but I wouldn't mind if you cut her tongue off, according to a Post story. You can see how everybody was excited about it. Now let's talk about the communist propaganda. They did a good job of themselves. I did have a flyer, but I couldn't find it, and they're offering for American soldier having a well-endowed lady there and money, and they're saying that they would, if you can have this woman and $10,000 if you will come over to their side, and they would drop those from the and spread those around and so forth. Unlike much Cold War era communist propaganda art, Vietnam was producing during active conflict. In other words, they weren't just making posters, they had art pieces, as you can see there, giving it a character, urgency, and style all of its own. Expelling foreign invaders and celebrating military actions, such as the shooting down of American planes, were common themes. Also regularly featured national symbols such as the lotus flower as well as the face of Ho Chi Minh. Women portrayed in posters in numerous roles, particularly and uniquely a frontline fighter. Many U.S. soldiers who fought in Vietnam will remember Hanoi Hannah, the silky voiced communist radio correspondent who urged young American GIs to stop fighting and go home. She is the most famous of dozens of Vietnamese journalists drafted by the communists to help the war effort. In a daily broadcast from the northern capital, Hanoi, Hannah would play music by Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, announce the names of American troops killed in fighting, and read clippings from U.S. newspapers by anti-war protesters. The Voice of Vietnam broadcast encouraged desertion and mutiny among American military ranks. They would also highlight a racial violence in America. The insinuation, who are you dying for? You're dying for the oppressors. With all this internal conflicts as backdrop, Hanoi Hannah continued encouraging divisive, calling for soldiers to frag, kill their commanding officers. Her scripts were written by the North Vietnamese army and were intended to frighten and shame the soldiers into leaving their post. She made 3 broadcasts a day, reading lists of newly killed or imprisoned Americans and playing popular U.S. anti-war songs in an effort to incite feelings of nostalgia and homesickness. Attempting to persuade U.S. GIs that the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War was unjust and immoral. She also received and played recorded messages from Americans who were against the war, saying later that she thought these messages were the most effective of all, as Americans who will believe their own people rather than their adversary. Now just think if you were a prisoner of war and you had to listen to that garbage every day, you start wondering about, did America forget me? You'd been there 5 or 6 years. You didn't even know for certain whether they even knew that you were a POW. And you had to listen to Jane Fonda and you had to listen to these people being broadcast. That alone would make it extremely hard to go through being a POW if you think you've been abandoned by your country. Okay. The International Encyclopedia of the First World War defined attrition warfare as the sustained process of wearing down an opponent so as to force their physical collapse through continuous losses in personnel, equipment, and supplies, or wearing them down to such an extent that their will to fight collapses. North Vietnam, aided by China, the Soviet Union, and other communist nations, fought South Vietnam, aided by U.S. and South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and others, spread over Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The war lasted 20 years. Much like World War II, the Vietnam War left an indelible mark on affected nations and people. It was characterized by extreme brutality and human suffering, a ubiquitous feature of attrition warfare. This is what happens when you have attrition warfare. What I'm talking about is we don't take land. We try to kill more of them today than they killed of us. If we had a battle and we killed 5 more of them than they hurt us, then we won that battle. High death tolls. This is a primary issue. Although all wars involve casualties, attrition warfare increases the number of combatants and civilians who are killed. High cost. Attrition warfare requires a lot of resources. Adjusting for inflation, the Vietnam War cost $770 billion plus $1 trillion for subsequent veterans' benefits. Those figures do not even take into account the impact on industry and economies. The potential for abuse. When maximum damage is the goal, There's more potential for war crimes to occur and for people to abuse their power. Long duration. A war of attrition may be lengthy and slow moving, as Sun Tzu wrote. There is no instance of a country having benefited from a prolonged warfare. The potential for an unstable outcome. Back to Korea. The outcome of attrition warfare is not always clear. A nation which is battered into submission may rebel in the future, and tensions are exacerbated. The unstable outcome of World War I is in part responsible for the outbreak of World War II. Long-term impact on a nation. Attrition warfare can cause serious long-term problems from both sides. The deaths of large numbers of young, mostly male combatants can lead to a dramatic drop in birth rates for years to come. It is estimated that World War I led to 3.2 million fewer births than would have been expected in Germany alone. If you go back to Vietnam today, you will see that. There's not a whole lot of people in their 60s and 70s moving around. Fewer people to work during and after war means a decrease in productivity and a change in structure of the economies. Money spent on fighting a war of attrition cannot be used for other areas, such as healthcare. Educational institutions often suffer as young people are less able to attend. Large areas of land are destroyed, damaging farmland, homes, and infrastructure. It can take decades for a nation to recover from the impact of attrition warfare. Guerrilla warfare clashed with attrition. Struggling to compete with an unpredictable guerrilla insurgency, which including raids, sabotages, and ambushes, the United States Army turned to attrition and sought to kill as many Vietnamese communists as possible. Rather than aiming to gain territory as in typical conflicts, the goal was to reach the highest feasible body count in order to batter Vietnam into submission. How do you tell when you're winning or losing in a war of attrition? Body count. The environment. Grunts. Infantry. Those are the guys who slump through the jungles. Walk for days and weeks at a time, patrolling the land for Vietcong guerrilla fighters or members of the North Vietnamese army. They walked without a bath, a hot meal, or a good night's sleep. They walked until they got jungle rot, infected skin lesions that came from humping the boonies, too long without adequate footwear. They walked with heavy rucksack, carrying everything they would need to survive in a difficult terrain. They carried food rations, flak jackets, rifles, and ammunition. They carried the fear that at any moment a surprise attack could kill them. Most crucially, they carried mosquito repellent and dry socks. Yes, the Vietcong and North Vietnamese army were trying to kill them, but so were the swarms of mosquitoes that spread dengue fever throughout camps and within 30 different kinds of venomous snakes, whose bites were proved to be fatal. If the land wasn't actively killing them, it was making them miserable. Morale was understandably low during monsoon season. For example, when the heavy rains would drench the soldiers and flood the rice paddies for the better part of 6 months, when it wasn't rain, it was hot and humid. Between the rain and the sweat, the grunts were never completely dry. If they weren't miserably wet or miserably hot, they were miserably hacking through the jungle brush and elephant grass, with leaves so dense and so sharp they drew blood. Even though it was hot, you had to pull your sleeves down. You're going through the elephant grass. Soldiers also had their blood sucked by leeches who made their homes in the rice paddies and streams. And boy, were they valiant there. In a war where morale was already weakened by unclear objectives and uncertain outcomes, unfriendly encounters with the Vietnamese civilians were essentially liberating, only made matters worse. In other words, with people we were trying to help, and now we're going in there and we don't know who's friendly and so forth, and it just, morale got worse. Although the official goal of the war was to prevent communism from spreading into South Vietnam, American soldiers felt they had reasons to mistrust everyone, North and South Vietnamese alike. Vietcong were adept at blending in, sometimes taking cover in villages. American troops didn't know if the villagers were aiding the Vietcong, harboring the enemies, or laying traps to kill American troops. Civilian casualties were common, and in many local villages were disrupted, if not outright destroyed, by the arrival of U.S. soldiers. So it's no surprise that locals often viewed American soldiers with distrust and hostility. And talking about the war of attrition and not doing land, let's just say that you go in like a Hamburger Hill. You go in there 3 days fighting, you lose a bunch of your buddies. You finally take the hill, and it's, hey, we got the hill now. We can relax. And no, we got to leave. They turned right back around and left the hill, 875. And before they got to the bottom of the hill, the communists were already back on top. So why did you spend 3 days fighting for that hill and taking it and then turn back around and giving it back to the enemy? That's what the war of attrition is about. Okay? Soldiers were tasked with the job of winning over the hearts and minds of the local Vietnamese population, convincing them that the Western liberation from communist forces would improve their lives. However, infantrymen whose success were determined by enemy body count were untrained and ill-equipped to make the cultural advances that would win people over. As time went on, civilian casualties continued. American soldiers grew increasingly frustrated with the locals' reluctance to help, and suspicions and mistrust increased on both sides. Quite often, the villages were caught between the two sides. If either side felt that the village had supported the other side, the village could be punished. There were sea rations left over from World War II and Korea, ready-made wet meals served in cans. But those proved to be too heavy for special operations that required long treks on foot. Instead, the military developed long-range patrol rations to take their place, LRPs, were freeze-dried, dehydrated rations that came in waterproof bags and were much lighter than the bulky cans soldiers had previously carried. The taste, however, left a lot to be desired. The rations were commonly compared to wet dog food, and the only way to heat them up in the field was by resorting to potentially dangerous explosives. Larry Michael, a former infantryman in Vietnam, reported that if you really wanted it hot, you broke up a claymore mine, took out the C4 explosives, lit it, and then warmed the food up. I got FOD there. But it was food. But that's the only way you could have it a hot meal. Now, even though you had quite a few different cans when we were using sea rations, quite often the grunts out in the field would not take a whole thing. They take the parts they liked from the sea rations. Between 1961 and 1971, Americans showered Vietnam with 45 million liters of herbicides. In the process, it doomed up to 4.8 million Vietnamese residents. The rationale sounded straightforward: drown the enemy's jungles in plant poison to prevent Vietcong from hiding. This meant poisoning everyone in the vicinity, but Uncle Sam assured everyone that Agent Orange wouldn't hurt anyone. Uncle Sam was dead wrong. U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs lists 14 different diseases, including Parkinson's and 7 kinds of cancers linked to Agent Orange exposure. That doesn't include the life-shortening disorders and severe disabilities suffered by the children of those exposed. It gets more depressing. For the Chicago Tribune in 1990, the VA revealed that the military realized Agent Orange was dangerous but used it anyway. And in fact, as the Guardian News detailed, the military sprayed Agent Orange that was 25 times more potent than its own guidelines suggested, which is pretty good. I thought it was 50. Okay. Not only the people of Vietnam, Americans and their allies that lived and fought in the Vietnam War, but the survivors of the Vietnam War are being affected by the defoliant chemicals used during the war. In the United States, 5 generations of children born to Vietnam veterans are also being affected. As you can see, that wasn't just Agent Orange. There was a whole crew. And how you can tell the difference, you see the barrel, it's got a stripe on it. If it had a blue stripe on it, it was Agent Blue. If it had a purple stripe on it, it was Agent Purple. With all herbicides with a little bit different mixes. Okay? Now, if you see the picture there, that is one child. Actually, it's one body and 2 children. Conjoined twins being cared for at Hanoi's Vietcong Hospital, a center for treating deformed children and others who may have been affected by exposure to the defoliant Agent Orange. During this war, lots of bombs, missiles, aircraft, and other weapons are used. And the most famous chemical weapon that was used during the war is napalm, a bomb which became famous because of the photo of a 9-year-old girl, Kim Phuc, running naked with a horrible war background behind, which was caused by a napalm bomb dropped accidentally by a South Vietnamese pilot. The two armies we faced. Most American military, at least at the beginning of the war, were trained prior to going to more traditional warfare with clear battle lines and identifiable foes. Once there, we quickly learned that the forward edge of the battle was always a circle around us, wherever we were, not a clear line of demarcation. You didn't have a line that said enemy on one side and you were in a circle and you were circled around by enemy no matter where you were. The VC, through a secondary force for the NVA, though a secondary force for the NVA, were masters at using this uncertainty to their advantage, whether as snipers or sappers or as gatherers of military intelligence. Although both the BC and the NVA shared a common goal of reuniting North and South Vietnam, essentially a unifying nationalist goal, the BC, unlike their northern members, were locals in South Vietnam. This gave them an especially strong commitment to the cause because they were fighting on behalf of their own village and families, not just for the national cause. In theory, the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, was the regular army official one of North Vietnam. The Vietcong was the derogatory term of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. And there's some uniforms. You can see the black pajamas the Vietcong were famous for, and then the uniforms of the NVA. So that was kind of give you the difference in uniform and equipment. Okay. NFL was a guerrilla form mostly by South Vietnamese civilians who opposed the South Vietnamese government backed by the United States, although their number was largely engrossed by the thousands of volunteers from North Vietnam. The NVA backed the Vietcong with weapons, supplies, accessories, and sometimes with recruits. When in 1965 the Vietcong was about to win the war and topple the South Vietnamese government, the U.S. intervened, sending combat troops to stop them. The arrival of farm soldiers in Vietnam prompted the NVA to covertly invade the South in support of the Vietcong with the better trained equipment and armed soldiers, even though all the time they were saying no. North Vietnamese NVA province were the former army of North Vietnam, while the Vietcong, in short for Vietnamese Communists, was the guerrilla army of South Vietnam. Actually, the Vietcong was formed from the remnants of the Viet Minh who had successfully fought the French. Many pro-communist Viet Minh were sent south when the country was split by UN votes to lie low until called upon to start an insurrection. A large part of the pro-nationalist element but anti-communist segments of the Viet Minh had been murdered shortly after 1954 to form a mostly complete communist insurrection. In other words, if you were a member of the Viet Minh and you were a nationalist, you could get your throat cut because you weren't communist. At the end of the war, the nationalists who were not communists were also sent to the re-education camps along with former South Vietnamese forces so they could get their thinking right. Russian military supplies. Probably a lot of you didn't realize they had tanks, anti-aircraft guns, and other guns. Russian military supplies completely transformed the nature of the war. People's Army of Vietnam, Vietnamese did not fight with just cunning and camouflage. They hit the Americans with firepower on a staggering scale. Their arsenal included 2,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery guns, over 5,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 158 surface-to-air rocket launchers. The new weapons, although not the latest in Moscow arsenal, were often more advanced than the American ones. American aircraft ran into skies streaking with SAMs and thick with anti-aircraft fire. The impact of the human cost of war. Approximately 58,000 American soldiers died. The average age of death was 23. That's questionable. I've heard 19, I've heard 22. 300,000 U.S. troops were injured. Returning soldiers were seen as the murderers of innocent people by opponents of the war and as losers by those who supported it. As a result, they faced much negativity. The American legions and VFWs did not want us because we were ones that had killed children and we lost the war. Soldiers that did not have to live with physical disabilities caused by war or injuries often suffered from mental health problems due to drug addiction and the trauma they had experienced. It is estimated 1 million Vietnamese soldiers were killed during the conflict and further 2 million wounded. Figures suggest 2 million Vietnamese civilians were killed and 5 million injured. Many homes were restored during the conflict, leaving 11 million refugees. Many of these lived in poverty and turned to drug addiction and prostitution due to the influence of American culture. Many U.S. soldiers had relationships with Vietnamese women, and approximately 100,000 children were born as a consequence. Around 3,000 children were taken from orphanages and hospitals and flown around the world to be adopted in Operation Baby Lift, but many were abandoned. The children were born from relationships between American troops and local women had challenging lives. They were seen as different and a reminder of the horrors of war. They suffered abuse and some were sold as laborers. Many soldiers developed cancer and other illnesses along with their children due to the effects of chemical weapons like napalm and Agent Orange. Even today, many Vietnamese and Americans develop illnesses and disabilities as a result of traces of chemicals remain in the soil. What the environmental cost was, in 1 year alone, the use of Agent Orange destroyed 2.47 million acres of forest in Vietnam. 741 acres of farmland were destroyed by chemicals dropped from U.S. forces, making it unusable food in production. 7 million tons of bombs were dropped, destroying roads, bridges, and import irrigation systems. There are still significant numbers of unexploded bombs across Vietnam. Been there, seen that. The war divided America. Many opposed it and felt America's actions were morally wrong. Others felt it was unpatriotic to question the government's actions and said anti-war protests were traitors and communists. The cover up of events like My Lai and Nixon's secret bombing of Cambodia created a culture of distrust to the government. I hope this will give you some insight on the American soldier and their allies, all the things they fought in the American Vietnam War. War is not fought just by the combatants, but so many other things are involved. We have not talked about some emotional battles fought: fear, frustration, boredom, killing another human being, being hunted like an animal yourself, not knowing who or what you can trust, sleep deprived, fatigue, homesickness, not knowing if what you are going through makes a difference, dealing with people of other cultures and languages, living conditions, availability of drugs, and the challenges back home. You can see all the protest stuff going on back home. Whether you were going to live and come home, all these play with the mind every day. Thank you. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Lessons of Vietnam. Today will be the last Lessons of Vietnam show. We started this mission of telling a real story of the Vietnam War and those involved, and we have striven to accomplish that mission. We started in 2013 and have acquired quite a list of subjects covered and available on demand at Nissan Communications. We've got some great shows. You can go back and listen to some of the older shows we did. Some of them are rough, but there's a lot of good information there. Excellent. I want to thank you for taking your time to explore the Vietnam War and the men and women involved. I appreciate all the guests that have been part of our show. You've been a valuable resource. I would not sign off without saying how much I have enjoyed working with Amnon Nissan and his Nissan Communications. I knew nothing about putting on a show like this. Without his teachings and guidance, none of our shows would have been possible. I gave him last-minute challenges that he handled beyond the call of duty. He has given freely of his studio, his time, and expertise for you and me. Thank you so much, Amnon, for being there when I need you.
My pleasure.
By the way, there are some great informative shows, both live and on demand, that are available from Nissan Communications that I highly recommend you check out. Go back to Nissan Communications and see some of the other shows he has and watch them, and I think that you'll learn a whole lot and you enjoy them. I just want to sign off by saying thank you so much and God bless America.
Thank you for all these years, Bill.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I hate to give it up, but since I had COVID and a shoulder operation, I haven't seemed to got all my strength back, and with all the other things that got this, it's just wearing me down too much. I have really appreciated it. I have enjoyed it. I get a lot of good comments, but I just thought it was time after all these years that we let people go back to some of our past shows.
Yep.
I thank you, and I thank everybody out there for giving us the opportunity. I have learned not to grunt so much when I think. In early shows, you could see when I was thinking about what I was going to say next, and I'd grunt, and Amnon finally beat me enough that I don't do as much.
All right, Bill. We'll be in touch anyway.
All right.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.